2 weeks ago at this Mass, I talked to you about how the Christian life is ultimately a relationship with God. He invites you to friendship with Him, to intimacy with Him. And I also mentioned how there can be a danger in the Christian life of just seeing the Christian life as the end of the Christian life just to stop sinning, when of course it's much more. But I also did mention in passing that sinning in fact is bad. Why? Because it actually affects our relationship with the Lord. And so last time I emphasized this reality of relationship that I think is primary, but today I want to focus on the reality of sin, because it's also important, because indeed it does affect what the Christian life is, which is our relationship with the Lord. Now, before I dive into this reality of sin, I just two asides that I want to mention. The first is, I really do think it's important to keep in context everything I said 2 weeks ago for the sake of this homily. Otherwise, I don't think this homily is going to land as well. And so, if you were here last week, just keep in mind everything I mentioned, 2 weeks ago. And if you were not here, I encourage you to maybe later this week to go back and listen to it. All our homilies, Sunday homilies are recorded, and we have a YouTube channel here at the parish, and they're put online. So I encourage you, if you were not here 2 weeks ago, you were at different Mass, that you go back and listen to that homily of 2 weeks ago to keep today's words in context. The second aside I just want to mention is that, talking about sin is not as fun as maybe just talking about how the Lord loves us and how He calls us to intimacy with Him. But it is very important to talk about sin. I don't know if it's ever happened to you that someone you love is hurting you or hurts you. And this person perhaps is unaware that they are hurting you, or that they have hurt you deeply, right? And when that happens, it's painful. And sometimes, depending on the situation, it's important to have a conversation about this so the other person becomes aware of the hurt, and so that the relationship can be restored. So something similar can happen with the Lord regarding sin. Perhaps we are offending the Lord and we don't really know. Perhaps we're hurting Him, right? And of course we do not want to hurt Him because we love Him. And so it's important that we do talk about sin. Right, so what is sin? Sin, as I've kind of alluded to, is an offense against God. It's an offense against the Lord. So sin is not breaking some random rule, right? Sin is offending someone. It's offending God. And we can offend God in two ways. We could do so directly, right? We could do something directly against Him, say we can curse Him, right? Or we could not give Him time. Or we could not acknowledge Him as God, like we could have other gods, idols. Or we could use His name inappropriately. We could directly offend Him. Or we could also offend Him indirectly by harming somebody that He loves. Harming somebody else. So you know that if somebody harms somebody you love, say one of your children or a close friend of yours, right? That person also hurts you by harming the one that you love. And so it is the same with the Lord. When we harm somebody else, our neighbor, whom the Lord loves, we also offend Him. Or even if we harm ourselves, because the Lord loves us, if we harm ourselves, right? We also hurt the Lord. We offend Him indirectly, right? Evil against His creatures or against ourselves is an offense against Him. So this is what sin is. Sin is an offense against God, and we can offend Him either directly or indirectly. Now, so as to give us clarity, the Lord gave us the 10 Commandments for us to know what it entails to love Him and to love others, right? He doesn't want us to guess what it means to love Him, right? If you want to know what it means to love Him, or love others, it's just really clear in the 10 Commandments. And this is what we heard in our first reading. It's God giving Moses the 10 Commandments. As we speak about the 10 Commandments, it's important that we see them again, not as random rules, but as good things. When Israel received the 10 words, the 10 Commandments, Israel was pumped about these 10 Commandments because they saw so much wisdom in them. They said, wow, if this is the way our God wants us to live, this is so good. It speaks to the desires of our human heart. Think about any relationship you have with maybe a friend or a spouse. What would you expect of this friend of yours or your spouse? You would expect them to treat you well. You would not like if they're lying to you all the time. You would not appreciate that. It hurts when somebody you love lies to you. You may not want them to kill you, right? Kind of obvious, right? You want them to be faithful to you, right? Your spouse, right? Adultery, right? You don't want them to be unfaithful to you. So the things that God gives us, His 10 Commandments, again, they're not just random rules. They're really what we desire in our hearts. We know when we are in the receiving end of one of the commandments, when somebody steals from us. Somebody stole my bike in college. It felt awful, right? It didn't feel nice. We were on the receiving end of the breaking one of the commandments. We experience an unpleasant thing. So His law, we know, is good. It does not restrict us, but gives us actually freedom. Commandments give us freedom. Maybe an image that comes to mind is kind of like driving around like traffic rules. We know there's so many traffic rules, right? Like you see a stop sign, you gotta stop. You see a red light, you gotta stop. You see a yellow light, you gotta speed up. Just kidding. Right? A green light, just go, right? All these rules, you have to have, your driver's license, insurance, all this stuff. But usually when you're driving, you're not really thinking of all these things. You just drive. And the fact that all these rules are around gives you the freedom to get from point A to point B. If there were none of these rules, right, nobody would know what to do, and so every intersection would be an issue of who's going first, who's not. If there would be no speed limit and a school zone, right, the accidents could happen, etc. Right? These rules give freedom, right? And so it's not a perfect analogy, but in a similar way, the commandments gives us freedom to be in relationship with God and in relationship with one another. To follow the commandments is to love God and others. And to not follow the commandments is to not love God and others. To follow the commandments is to be in good relationship with God and others, and to not follow the commandments is to not be in good relationship with God and others. Now, as we speak about sin, I want to maybe you already are aware of this, but there's kind of two levels of gravity of sin. St. John, in his first letter, I think it's chapter 5, he speaks about this. He says when we offend God or really other people, there's kind of two levels of gravity. This is what we call grave offense, grave sin, or mortal sin. And then there's kind of smaller offenses, what we call venial sin, right? Grave sin really affects our relationship with God or others. Mortal sin. And then venial sin is smaller offenses that do affect the relationship with God and others, but not in a very intense way. A human example of this would be, just think of any relationship, maybe with a good friend of yours or your spouse. If they're a little bit short with you, well, that's not nice, that's not good, but, it's not like a grievous offense, right? Maybe a simple kind of, hey, I'm sorry about, being short earlier today. That kind of suffices. It's just a small offense, and a small kind of just reconciliation suffices. But if your friend stabs you in the back, completely betrays you, right? If your spouse is unfaithful to you, right? A simple, hey, I'm sorry about that, and just keep going doesn't really suffice. It's a grave offense, right? It actually damages the relationship in a more serious way. So a more serious kind of reconciliation has to take place. Some serious conversations going to be had with your friend if that relationship is going to continue kind of moving forward, right? Because a grave offense took place. Well, it's the same thing with God. We can offend Him gravely with mortal sin, or just in small ways. When we offend Him in small ways, right? A small kind of, Lord, I'm sorry about that. In our prayer suffices, that's it. When we offend Him gravely, right, just saying sorry, Lord, about that doesn't really suffice. When we are in a state of mortal sin, when we commit a grave offense against the Lord, which I'll explain a little bit more what that entails, but when we commit a grave offense against the Lord, our relationship with Him has been kind of broken. It's one of the things that the church tells us, and actually St. Paul speaks about this, is that when we have committed grave sin, we should not approach Holy Communion until we're reconciled with the Lord in confession. Right? Because our relationship has been broken. We can't just be having this intimate thing with the Lord or receiving Holy Communion where we have not fixed our relationship. And the way we fix our relationship is in confession. Let me read you the words that St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, regarding this reality of receiving the Lord when our relationship with Him has been kind of damaged gravely. He says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a man examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself. So some very serious words of the fact that if we have damage, if we have fallen into grave sin with the Lord, we need to go to confession and reconcile ourselves with the Lord before we go back to Holy Communion. And kind of the gospel speaks about this. I mean, Jesus' actions on the temple are really serious. He sees they're profaning where the Lord abides, the presence of the Lord, the temple, and he does something really like crazy. He overturns tables, kicks people out of the temple because it's serious. That's the presence of the Lord. And we know the presence of the Lord or that we have is really the Eucharist, right? And so therefore, great reverence needs to be had. If we fall into a grave sin, it's important that we reconcile with the Lord in confession, right, before we go back. A simple just, I'm sorry, Lord, about a grave thing doesn't suffice, just like it doesn't suffice in a regular relationship with a friend or a spouse. Okay, so how do we know when we have actually gonna really hurt our relationship with the Lord? What constitutes a grave sin, a mortal sin, and a grave offense against the Lord? So 3 things have to happen for us to really, really damage our relationship with the Lord. The first thing is we have to do something that's grave. The thing that we do actually has to be a really bad thing. The second thing is that we have to know that it's a bad thing. We're unaware that this is a bad thing. Well, you know, we're I guess, less culpable insofar as that we're just not aware of the thing being bad. Maybe like a kid does something bad and they don't know, right? They're not responsible because they didn't know, right? So even if the thing was bad. So the thing has to be bad. We have to know, we have to be aware that it is bad. And the third thing is that we have to freely choose it, right? If we do it by accident, like let's say it's a bad thing and we know it's bad, but we do it by accident, well, you know, or somebody forces us to do it, right? Well, then it wouldn't be a grave sin because we're not freely actually choosing it. But if the thing is grave, if we know that it is grave, and then we freely choose it, then we have offended the Lord gravely. We have committed what we call a mortal sin, and it really has affected our relationship with the Lord. And so we should go to confession before we resume and have this intimate thing with the Lord in communion. Now, what constitutes a grave thing? I'm going to give you some examples. It's a non-exhaustive list. But basically, if you follow the 10 commandments that we were talking about earlier, if you break one of those commandments in a serious way, not in a small way, but in a serious way, that would constitute a grave thing. So one of the 10 commandments in a serious way, if you break one of those in a serious way, that would constitute a grave thing. And so if you do that knowingly and willingly, then that's a mortal sin. Some examples, I'm just going to go through the 10 commandments, not exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea. So first commandment is loving God above everything, right? So if you were to have an idol, let's say you were to say, hey, I believe in Jesus equally as I believe in Buddha or something. It's not good, right? Because you're saying the Buddha is God when he's not, right? So if you consciously say, I believe in this other God, and you consciously do that, that would be a serious break of the first commandment. Second commandment is about using the Lord's name in vain, right? Profaning the Lord's name. So if you were to swear upon the Bible, right, and then lie, like using God's name and then lie, that would be a serious break of the second commandment. And so if done knowingly and willingly, then that would be a mortal sin. Third commandment is about keeping the Lord's Day holy. So usually one of the main ways in which we keep the Lord's Day holy is coming to Sunday Mass. So if we don't come to Sunday Mass, that's a grave offense against the Lord. If we do it knowingly and freely, right? If we're sick and we can't come, well, we can't come, right? If something impedes us from coming, we're taking care of our sick child, well, we can't come. It's not even a small sin. It's not a sin at all, right? If something impedes us from coming, then it's not a sin at all. But if we can come and we choose not to freely, then it is a grave sin. Fourth commandment has to do with honoring our mother and father. And so if we are really, really nasty, like overboard nasty and dishonoring our parents, and then that would be a grave matter. Fifth commandment has to do about not killing. So this would include things like murder or abortion or euthanasia or even harming ourselves greatly, like with drugs or maybe a grave abuse of alcohol. Like if we're harming ourselves or others in a grave way, like the ones I mentioned, that would be grave matters. So if we do that knowingly and freely, then it would be a grave mortal sin. Sixth commandment has to do with sins against the flesh. And so adultery, being unfaithful to one's spouse, having relations with somebody to whom you're not married in the church, impure acts with oneself, pornography, or contraception, right? Using contraception for the sake of not conceiving, right? All those would be like a grave way of breaking the sixth commandment. So if we do so knowingly and freely, again, it would be a mortal sin. Seventh commandment has to do with stealing. And so if we were to steal something really big, right, really big, or something that really hurts somebody else, so say it's a poor person, and even if what we steal from that person is small, but it's all their livelihood, like that would be then a grave way of breaking this commandment. The eighth commandment has to do with bearing false witness. So if we were to lie in such a way that really harms somebody, let's say we lie and then somebody's reputation is completely ruined, or we lie and somebody goes to jail because we lied, so it's a big lie, a serious break of lying. If we were to do that, then it would constitute a grave matter. And the last two commandments are about coveting, so desiring somebody else's spouse or somebody else's goods. Just a regular desire for those things, kind of like a fleeting desire, is not a grave break of these commandments. But if we were to foster these desires and perhaps begin to plan on how to take somebody else's spouse or how to take somebody else's goods, then we're taking that too far, right? And then it would constitute a grave matter. And if we do that knowingly, again, and freely, then it would be a mortal sin. The Christian life is about relationship. Lent is about relationship, right? And so part of that is, praying, spending time with the Lord, getting to know Him, be known by Him. But it's also about not offending the Lord, right? And we offend Him, as we know, through sin. And so Lent is such a good time to examine our lives. How am I living? Am I committing grave offenses against the Lord? And if so, the amazing thing is that the Lord is so merciful. He will always forgive us if only we go to Him with a humble heart and a repentant heart, right? And we can go to confession, and we are sure that He will always forgive us. So let us take an opportunity of this Lent of working in our relationship with the Lord, spending time with Him, but also making sure that we are not offending Him with sin.